So thank you all for joining us today. So best laid plans, I'm sorry, my technology stopped right there at 5:30. But I'm excited to get us started today. We're going to talk with Dr. Julie Irish and Dr. Andrea Wheeler. They're going to talk to us about a presentation and work that they've been doing related to revitalizing a community and creating homes for adults with autism, the potential for regenerative architecture. And so we're really excited to have you all here and to learn a little bit about the work that you are doing.
Well, thank you for inviting us. I know we've been kind of corresponding for a long time, so I'm really grateful and glad to be here. So my name's Julie Irish. Hopefully Andrea is somewhere.
I am here.
There you are. Yes.
It's nearly midnight here. No, it's 11:30. So.
Okay, so I'll dive straight into the project and tell you bits about some of the background of. Oh, hang on, my computer's frozen now. Why is that? Okay. Right. Okay, there we are. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act and related legislation, children with disabilities are entitled to a free, appropriate public education, well, up until their age 21. So the question is, what happens after they're 21? And there's a lack of community housing, lack of affordable community housing, lack of community support, and often the existing housing models that don't support the unique needs of individuals with autism. So just to give you a brief outline of autism, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's currently diagnosed in 1 in 54 children. I actually had to update that slide because the last data that came out for the Centre for Disease Control was 1 in 58. It's now, the latest figures produced, they're saying it's 1 in 54. I noticed in some of my previous notes in 2009 it was 1 in 110. Wow. So a lot of people being diagnosed with autism. And described as a spectrum because there's a spectrum of different ability or disability levels. Some of the main characteristics is that there's difficulties in communication, difficulties empathizing with other people. So that can make it difficult, if you're in a community housing situation. People also have sensitivity to the environment, particularly light and sound, either that someone is oversensitive to the environment or they're under sensitive to the environment. Neither of which conditions have been very much researched in relation to autism. So how the background to this particular project around community housing then? As I said, there's not much supports for young adults when they leave full-time education. So, a lot of families want their adult children to be able to go and live fulfilling lives in the community, but they're often left with few options. So there are some housing schemes by non-profits and for-profit groups. Sometimes you find parents banding together to create a home. That centre image there is of a group in Wisconsin, parents who banded together and are actually building a new build project called Home of Our Own, and it's kind of a mixed residential development that will also have links to the community and to housing and job opportunities. But that's like just what one group of parents is having to set out by themselves to do. And how I came really across this issue was that several years ago, a non-profit called Autism Speaks highlighted these issues in an international competition, and they were actually offering 3 prizes of $50,000 for groups or individuals to come up with housing initiatives, if you like, in 3 categories of young adults that needed weekly support or daily support or 24/7 support. I actually entered the competition. My idea was converting motels into homes for adults with autism. Fortunately, I didn't win 50,000 prize, but I was mentioned in their executive summary, but I didn't win 50,000. So that was like the background of my interest in this particular topic around housing for autism. So I shall let Andrea
Oh dear.
talk now about regeneration.
So I'm Andrea Wheeler, and I'm an associate professor of architecture. I'm also incoming president-elect of the Faculty Senate, and I teach popular classes in the School of Architecture on green and sustainable architecture. And I'd like to describe what was my contribution. It's a very small contribution to this BNIM award of Julie's. And I want to describe my own work and interest in the project and leave the rest to Julie. The examination of the practice foundations of regenerative architecture and the planning objectives of the regenerative approach to architecture was my work. And it derives from an overall ambition, regenerative architecture derives from an overall ambition that a building can add positively to an environment, to the human, the social, and the natural environments. It can regenerate them. And my contribution to the BNIM award set out as an aim to critically examine the theoretical underpinnings of the regenerative paradigm for the built environment. So why examine the ambitions of regenerative architecture and its theoretical underpinnings? And what was or is the practice, what is the value of doing this for practice? And I'd like to sort of illustrate, first of all, with a story about the beginnings of this project. And when we were described regenerative architecture by the managers of the BNIM Researcher Award, it was described as the new way, the new approach for environmentally attentive, for sustainable, for want of a better word, design. And this was the point. Sustainable architecture was passé, because sustainable architecture sustained the status quo. Regenerative, on the other hand, on the contrary, was radical. It suggested radical change. Regeneration was the new word. And of course, sustainable architecture, to me, as a sustainable architecture teacher, also suggests change, both social and environmental. But it was a theory argument made at the start. And I have to say, probably a little unknowingly, it sort of riled me as this sustainable design teacher, because I knew that those working in the field wouldn't make such an argument. They would not suggest that sustainable architecture did not have a human, equitable or social agenda. It was a rhetoric, and it was this new and better way, this radical way for architecture and designers to think about design aspirations and the ambitions, the overall ambitions of this field, it was this that sort of made me want to truly examine the underpinnings. So regenerative architecture was proposed as the way to push the field forward and for designers to achieve greater change. The new intention, that is to say, the adding positively, also suggested a new set of objectives, imperatives of planned action to achieve the goal of adding to the environment more than a building takes. Imperatives would mean the design would be positive and hence regenerative. So imagine, and I'm trying to suggest to you what this regenerative architecture might mean, or what the aspiration is intended to be. So imagine for a moment this world where you participate in the environment around you, and in doing so you give back more than you take. The environment invites you to give back more than it takes. Imagine moving through this world. What would it look like? What does it feel like? What can you see, touch, sense? What can you smell, maybe? Of course, as you can all imagine, the aspiration of regenerative architecture sets this bar very high for design, and it itself poses practical problems. It is a challenge. And the regenerative design tool that we looked at was the Living Building Challenge, which has its imperatives, it has its must-dos for designers, categories of concern that are described as place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity and beauty, and with subdivisions within them of attentiveness to urban agriculture, net positive water, net positive energy, healthy interiors, no red list materials, responsible sourcing, access to nature, universal access and inclusion, beauty and education. The categories and the subdivisions for architects are extensive and demanding. The method sets itself up against LEED, which is the US industry standard, describing the LEED approach as too easy. But LEED has certified thousands of buildings. The full Living Building Challenge certification, the regenerative tool we looked at, has been awarded tens, and those awarded are predominantly demonstration or educational buildings. However, the problem is more than just the difficulty of the practice of the imperatives. Well, for me it is. Imperatives too difficult to achieve in the everyday. And the problem is not with simply the need to improve practice to achieve the goals as set. It is about the imperatives themselves and the underlying theory. And this is my concern, and this is my field. It is about the underlying ambition. It is about the issue is about how we see the problem of sustainable development, how as designers we see the problem. And how we see it is really how we describe the method to achieve our solution. How we see the problem defines how we create the solution. So to state it in theory terms, it's really about framing the problem of sustainable design. And even with the bar set high and acting as an aspiration to designers, are these must-dos really going to achieve a building that adds more to the environment? Julie's project asks us to think about inclusive design, to think in a deep way about design for inclusion as a dimension of regenerative design. Julie's project widens the social agenda of the sustainable or the regenerative. There is a book that I suggest to my students called Sustainability Without the Hot Air, and it is all about seeing through the numbers presented by the media, and in the case of regenerative architecture and the Living Building Challenge, who are a company in themselves that sells the certificates just like LEED does. The question is about selling the frame of measurement of how we understand the positive. This is about the rhetoric of the positive, and it is not about building science. So my own contribution to the BNIM award was small in terms of the organization and the outreach. But why examine? Why examine how design for autistic spectrum disorder can challenge the agenda of regenerative architecture? Why is this important to theories of sustainable and regenerative architecture? Why critically examine the theoretical underpinnings of the regenerative paradigm? And why did I want this as an objective of our BNIM project? Really, it's to find out if we are asking the right questions in sustainable architecture. There is critical literature in this field, and I've reviewed it, and it tends to focus on the notion of this additive nature of regenerative design. But the foundation for me needs to be examined further. And for me, I want to ask questions like, what if design for autistic spectrum disorder was simply a recognition of the many different ways of seeing the world, of being in the world, and being attentive to the world and other human beings in it. And this recognition of the importance of such attentiveness, this very particular way of being, could be conceived as the beginning of a different sort of regenerative architecture practice. This brings the BNIM project into my own world, into contemporary philosophy, into the connection with a deeply sensitive understanding and perception of the world and those underrepresented in it, and towards a philosophy about the birth of new notions of human being in the world. So I want to leave much of the actual project with students to Julie to describe. And there were observations from student design practice about how difficult regenerative architecture and regenerative design was. But I do want to leave with a letter I received. There's a letter I received about regenerative design from one of the founding members, one of the architects that were close to the initial setting up of the Living Building Challenge. It was a long letter, but also, interestingly, a critical letter about regenerative architecture itself. And the author says, personally, I do not believe that there is a great way to measure regenerative architecture, because I'm not sure that architecture by itself can be regenerative. Regenerative design and development happens when a diverse group of people who are connected to one another and to their place, begin an evolution of actions that together add vitality to all of the living systems within their life shed. Life shed nurtures the community, and the community continues to nurture the life shed. People are participating in living systems, bringing health and gaining the hope and inspiration to carry on. It progresses over time toward greater health, and while it may begin with a building project, it never ends with one. Over to you, Julie.
Okay.
Sorry.
So that was the background to the project, and this was the aims of the grant. You know, as Andrea's explained, investigate that regenerative paradigm, looking at the living building challenge, and our other main aim was to looking at how the design of homes for young adults with autism could impact the urban communities in which they might be based, and actually looking at regenerating a community. So various collaborations and grants, you know, the BNIM Regenerative Design Challenge, as well as, you know, Andrea and myself. We had Daniel Coleman from Community and Regional Planning, Diane Al-Shahabi from Historic Preservation, and Nikesh Muek from Architecture and Historic Preservation. We also linked in with that, we had an inclusive initiatives grant, Hold Design Charette, which I'll talk about a bit later. And we partnered with Eric Olson from Apparel and Events Management and Hospitality from that. And my class, they also had a Miller Open Education mini grant, which I still, although it was my submission, I count it as collaboration because it was a good way to collaborate with people from the libraries department, particularly Abby Elder, who manages these grants, which I would recommend as a way to provide open access, open resource materials for students. So that was another kind of good collaboration. So the background to our project then is that we had 3 graduate students from community and regional planning, who were led by Daniel Coleman. Their task was to find suitable vacant properties that could be suitable to convert into housing for young adults with autism. Their brief was firstly to look at vacant properties in Iowa, and if there wasn't anything suitable, to expand their search to the Midwest, and they were to find both newer and historic vacant properties. They didn't need to look outside of Iowa. There were plenty of properties available in Iowa. They came up with a short list of 3 properties which they recommended to us for the student projects. I went to sites to actually visit them to see what their suitability was. Probably the top one I would have selected, the owners refused permission for us to access the property. That's the image up actually in the slide there. That was a whole site in Knoxville that was a former veterans hospital. I think there'd been a lot of bad press about it because the site had been abandoned and was very overgrown and run down. I think they didn't want people poking around and seeing how far the buildings had deteriorated, and probably might not have been accessible by students. So we ended up with kind of 2 properties then. So there were 3 classes that were involved. Dan Al-Shahabi's historic preservation class, Nikesh Muek's architecture studio, and my class, inclusive environments. Diana Mikesh worked on a historic building, whereas I worked on a newer building. So with the limitations of time we have, I'll just talk about the project that my students worked on. So this was a class called Inclusive Environments, which my background is in the accessible design, inclusive environments. So along with their other learning objectives, what I wanted them to do was to apply that knowledge about inclusivity to the design problem that we had, that we knew existed, about housing for young adults with autism. So they'd worked on the first part of the fall semester. They did a lot of background work on inclusivity, and then the last part of the semester they worked on this project as their a studio type project. So we had a lot of collaborations within the community. The rail tour that supported us and gave us a lot of information about the locality, and enabled myself and the students to visit the site that was actually in Waterloo in Iowa. We also visited the Waterloo Community Development Housing Office, so they were able to tell us about the housing needs of that population in Waterloo. We had quite close links with a group called Balance Autism, whose headquarters is in Des Moines. They support people with autism from children up to adulthood. So they were a keen supporter of ours. And then as the project went on, different aspects of the project, I assume facilities management and sustainability were really interested in our project. Kevin Nordmeyer was the principal of BNIM Architects, took a real interest in the project. Somebody contacted me from the Department of Human Development and Family Studies, and she was actually a graduate student, and she had children with autism, so she was really interested in what we were doing, and she came to talk to the students as well. And then through her I was invited to the capital to be a guest of the Iowa Autism Council. So just by working on the project, we were able to form links with different groups that we didn't necessarily expect or foresee at the beginning. And one of the first things to set up the student projects, and I say these 3 classes working on the project, was that we held a design charrette. And that's, in design terms, that's usually kind of high focused, concentrated effort where you're given a design problem and work together in teams, and at the end of the day come out with a finished project. So in our charrette, it was more like being able to draw students and community members and professionals together in one highly concentrated day. They could have hear different lecturers speak on different aspects. And we had Brian Hurd, who's a leader in community planning and social justice. We had somebody who was involved in setting up the Living Building Challenge. We had our students from community and regional planning who'd done the background to the work. So it was just a way of our students getting a lot of background information and expert guidance as they began their projects. So a particular assignment that my students in inclusive environments were set was that they had to repurpose and redesign an existing building into a home for young adults with autism. And in tandem with that, they had to examine the principles of the Living Building Challenge. I explained earlier that the autism is a spectrum disorder. So students were tasked with either creating housing solutions for young adults who needed daily support, or young adults who needed 24-hour support, because there is quite a bit of difference. In fact, I think a couple of teams chose to combine those two aspects. The spaces they could design were quite open, public spaces, private spaces. They had to be aware of sensory sensitivity that I described about people with autism often have. They had to be aware of branding, and for the the housing, the home, to be a positive image in the neighbourhood. They had to consider outdoor areas, and they also had to consider how they could engage with the local community, this idea of regenerating the community. And Andrea talked about the living building challenge. That was one of the companion pieces to the project. For my students, they didn't go into depth into the living building challenge. They concentrated their efforts on some of these petals that Andrea mentioned, and because of the work that they were doing focused on interior design, most of them focused on things like place, health and happiness, materials, equity and beauty, rather than water or energy, because that was more outside of the remit of their project. But they did have to be sure to incorporate at least one petal into their project. So the site we had was in Church Row in Waterloo, which is in the Cedar Falls metropolitan area with a population of about 68,000. And the building was in an area dubbed Church Row because of the number of churches in it. I'm not sure what the correct way of describing it is, but it was like a pretty run-down area, quite a few buildings that were boarded up. Seemed to be like a lot of apartment blocks there, lacking green space, a lack of shops and grocery stores, and infrequent public transport. Our site was a former community college that was actually two buildings adjacent to one another. They've been kind of linked, if you can see that, with that little kind of walkway between the two. About 31,000 square foot for the building, and a very large car park area. It was a large site. It was 2.5 acres of land. So some students had the idea of like selling off some of the land to help develop the interior of the property into housing. I think the building was listed for about $599,000, which is about $19 a square foot. So you can see some of the existing elevations there. The building was structurally sound and had been well maintained because it had been used as a community college until recently. But you can see by the image there with the car parking, it was quite a concrete jungle in that surrounding area. And the interiors were quite dated and quite gloomy with limited natural light. In the thinking of this as a real world project to keep costs down, the students kept the core element like the stairs and the elevators and the existing windows, although they could add more. The front entrance itself was not accessible to Americans with Disabilities standards. So students reorientated the main entrance to the rear of the building. It was like a two-story building. So that's the background to the project, how the students were set up to work on it. I'll just show you some of their projects. So this was a student who called her project Pathways. She describes it as providing need-sensitive spaces that promote community engagement and independence. The spaces are divided into public and private areas to create balance and allow residents choice in their daily activities. Pathways also serves to bring together the surrounding community, providing green space, new businesses and learning opportunities. So I think the students were aware that these could be vulnerable young adults living in residential accommodation, whilst wanting to bring the community in. You know, there's also wanting to separate the private spaces from the more public spaces. So the students took that on board as well. And you can see she's got some nice exterior views there, trying to bring the area to life. And the petals she chose from the Living Building Challenge were equity and materials. And these are some of her interior views. So students had to, plan out all their spaces that they were going to use, and it was quite free on what they could use as special spaces. So it all came out with different ideas. Just show you, these are the apartments that she created for the adults with autism. And I think, all the students tried to get away from an institutional feel. They wanted, people with disabilities to have just as, much nice living quarters as anybody else. So more of kind of like, the spa-like feel of things, and the idea that people could rearrange and personalise their homes as they wanted to. So that features in most of the students' work. This is another project, and they called their project Umbrella Abode, and that's a space for young adults who need both the daily and the 24/7 support. So their concept, would be a place that promotes autonomy for residents of all capability levels. They chose to look at the equity petal. So they picked out particular elements from that it would be, their project is on a humane scale. They wanted or aimed to get in that universal access to nature and place. Equitable investment is part of that Building Challenge equity petal, and creating just organisations. That's just for the community and for the residents. So again, making a lot of that, outdoor space, and thinking of play areas for the community, to bring the community into the whole sphere. Again, you can see there, space planning exercises for the different rooms they created. If I show you a more detailed example, like they suggested a movie theatre in there. So that wasn't something that was available within the church row that the building was located, but thinking of how then, they could, it was a way of bringing the community in to integrate with residents and provide something for the community. And then they did, we've got like a cafe there, so lots of student groups were creating like a cafe or restaurant area that again residents could be a part of, as well as community members. They've got their daily support gathering space, which look more open than their 24/7 support space would have done. Okay, this is another group of students who called their project Aspire. So they took a slightly different take, and they created their design for young adults with autism, thinking about their needs in reference to whether somebody had hypo or hypersensitive sensitivities to the environment. So basically, if you were hypersensitive, you were very sensitive to, say, lighting or sound, so providing more of a a calming environment or a calming interior. Whereas if somebody is hyposensitive, they have more of a tendency to be under-stimulated by the environment. And I think in practice it would be quite difficult to make that split, because many people might be hypersensitive to one thing or hypersensitive to another, and vice versa. But I thought it was an interesting way that they had set their project out. So their concept then, that was by providing private and public spaces, it would allow users to better integrate in society by strengthening their social interaction skills and encourage well-being. And the spaces were designed to focus on equity for all users. They focused on the beauty petal of the Living Building Challenge, so looking at that exterior landscaping, and on the equity petal again, so trying to think of a community that was inclusive to everybody. Again, you can see some of their space planning renderings and how they divided their space into spaces for people who were hypersensitive and people who were hyposensitive. If I just kind of hone in on their designs. One of the kind of special elements that they put into their project was an aquatic activity room. Again, that was quite an unusual thing to do, but it was thinking of how people might be stimulated by water and having that sensory experience, if you like. So I thought that was quite an interesting take on how they'd thought of that. And then you can see the bedroom image there. So they're thinking of how they can stimulate hyposensitive people. So thinking about different things like controllable lighting, curtains to reduce outdoor night noise. They thought about a rocking chair that somebody was that needed to give themselves sensory stimulation. So I thought they they thought about little details to support somebody. And at the end of the semester then, all the students in all 3 classes presented their work, and we invited all the people that had attended the design charrette and all the people that had supported the students throughout the semester. So it was a nice way of students marking the end of their projects together and getting some feedback from the communities that they'd worked with. And at the end of the semester, I asked my students to write a final reflection paper. I didn't actually ask them to concentrate on the class. The reflection paper was about things like the 3 things they'd learned in class and how they would use it. But I've highlighted these things because they talked about the project. So things like design has the power, this power that could change the world and solve social problems. we have this need, and it's the responsibility of designers to design a space for adults with autism. And then another student who said, I felt like the presentations about autism helped me to drive my design choices in order to provide a better life for those who may not always have their environments reflect their needs. And then Andrea had come into class to give a lecture to them about regenerative architecture. So this is another student saying, something that was really exciting to learn about in inclusive environments was the presentation given by Andrea on regenerative housing. The reason I really appreciated this was because sometimes environmental strategies we have been taught so far felt somewhat incomplete. The regenerative housing presentation proposed different, more thorough methods of considering sustainability in interior design and architecture. So I think that was important, that it opened their eyes to other things beyond, that kind of almost like a buzzword of sustainability. And as a project, it had an impact. The 3 students from community and regional planning who took part in the project, their project was selected for the Iowa State Fair's Standing Innovation pitch-off, and they got through to the final round of that. 3 students had a poster accepted for Environmental Design Research Association conference, which just went online in April, and we'd also had 3 abstracts accepted for that about the project, and another one that Andrea's leading on in September for the Passive and Low Energy Architecture Conference. So we've been able to more publicise our research. So obviously there are limitations to the project. We were working on a studio type project in what was predominantly a lecture class, so the students were a bit rushed to work on everything to finish it to a high standard. And obviously the work is theoretical. There's no outcomes. We weren't able to build anything. It's difficult, I found before, in projects like these to actually engage directly with young adults with autism, which is ideally what you would like to do, is interview young adults themselves. And while we did try to do that, that is difficult to do, I know from previous experience, but we did manage to engage with a parent with young adults with autism, so that was very beneficial for the students. And I think ideally my ambition would be to create a demonstration project to actually convert a property to actually set up a bedroom and apartment scenario, so people could actually see how it worked, and then we could tweak the designs based on that. And then Andrea spoke already about the limitations of the regenerative design tools, and how do we analyze a building? Can we analyze a building? So future research then, we have a new project, the Fieldstead Endowment for Community Enhancement, that which is for what I describe as an horizontal options studio, which depending on how things go in the next couple of months, if that will be for the spring studio or for spring 2022, that will be working on a similar project, housing for young adults with autism, but bringing in other disciplines that we don't normally work with, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, civil engineers. How can students in those groups work together to create a design which would replicate more the practice experience that I'm used to. You know, structural engineers, there's all, you know, a lot of, you know, business majors. There'll be a lot of other people that have an input into projects. So how can we all draw those together, continuing on with this research? And, you know, we've enjoyed particular support from our collaborators for the life of the last project, so looking to them to help us with this, the next phase as well. So what did we learn from this? Well, you see, we need more research into the design of environments for people with autism, and projects like this can raise out students' awareness and empathy for this population and of the sustainable and regenerative building practices. Hopefully it will encourage the formation of other collaborative research teams, and, you know, thinking of how a project like this can impact our urban communities as well through reusing existing buildings and the environmental and cost impact of that. And as I said at the beginning, remembers that, you know, 1 in 54 children are diagnosed with autism, and there was 1 in 54 are growing up and will be transitioning into adulthood at some point, and, you know, at some point we need supports for them in the future. So, okay, thank you for listening. Thank you for having us here. Any questions?
Thank you, Julie and Andrea. I will say, you know, as someone who works closely with young children and families on the autism spectrum, I just think that your work and your projects, including student learning and community engagement together, is so impactful, and it's been exciting to hear about this work. So I know we just have a few minutes. I'll open up the floor to any questions or comments. So you all could unmute as you talk or provide your comments, or you could also use the chat function.
Hi, Julie. This is Greg. I just gave you a little thumbs up virtual comment there. I really appreciated learning about this area, and for taking the time. It was really great to hear how you and Andrea kind of connected on this and how it impacted the students. And, you know, I could tell by their comments, I liked reading those, the reflections. That's kind of why I enjoy service learning as well, that you really get to see students take real action when they have a challenging problem, and they're able to, you know, apply their skills in real world settings. So I love that.
Okay.
No real questions, but I just enjoyed it.
And we're getting that. I don't know if you all can see the chat, but you're getting some comments that way too. So Connie Beecher and Monica Haddad have also just said, great work, great project, and have enjoyed to hear about the work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we might have had a quiet group today, but certainly we can share Julie and Andrea's contacts if you want to follow up with them with any additional comments. And I'll just say as well that we'll be having one last Engaged Scholars talk for this semester. So be looking for that invite in your inboxes. We'll be having Amy Zarling from the Department of Human Development and Family Studies next week on the 30th of April. So coming up.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting us. We appreciated the opportunity to share our research.
Thank
And
you
we'll have
so much.
more coming, with more coming with U-Turn down the road. So we'll find ways to further connect you all. So thanks.
Okay, thank you.